What if the news shaping your worldview is more distorted than reality itself? Today on Barred Conversations, I'm sitting down with Lisa Sigatek, newspaper owner and president of the Alberta Weekly Newspaper Association, who just returned from Spain, where social media screamed, "Don't go," but the truth on the ground was completely different. We're cutting through the noise on media bias, why algorithms are dumbing down society, the power of local journalism, and why critical thinking has never been more important in the age of AI and echo chambers. If you're a business student or a young pro who wants honest, no fluff feedback on communication, adaptability, and questioning everything you read, this raw conversation is for you. Let's get into it.
Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, we've known each other for, with, I guess if we say 25 or 26 or 27 years, it ages us both. But like fine wine, I feel we get better with age. Yeah, I'm the owner of the Crowsnest Pass Herald. It's a family owned business, so I'm second generation. We've owned our newspaper since 1930. So this year will be our 95th year in the Crowsnest Pass. In 2017, I felt that the industry needed some voices that maybe had different opinions. And so I joined the board of the Alberta Weekly Newspaper Association as a director, then became vice president, and now I'm on my second term as president of the Alberta Weekly Newspaper Association. We rep all the weekly newspapers in Alberta and Northwest Territories. So it's been kind of fun. It's very interesting to start out as a person who just worked part-time to now, trying to shape what is news media in this new landscape.
Yeah, and I think you made a post as you just came back from Spain on LinkedIn, and I think it really caught my attention because one of the things is as I travel with teams in the US, Europe, and that over the case teams, I think one of the things we use is we use a lot of media. That media is used while we're in Canada training for the competition, potentially preparing case solutions, but also while we're in the country. And I think one of the things that we really struggle with is what's the real picture? And I think one of the things is you're presenting to locals that know the country, know the company. And I think it's really hard as someone and a group coming in as foreigners really to talk about and get that reality. And I think that was what your post was about. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that and this idea of how do we get to what's actually happening and try to get rid of some of those biases?
Some of the noise, right? And I think that's the part of my industry that's been most upsetting to me is that, I've always been very proud to be a part of a newspaper industry. I always say that we were created to be the check and balance of democracy. So our job was to report both sides of a story and let the reader come up with what their answer is. If you do it right, that's supposed to be our job. But now we have polarization of media, especially on the national level. And I really think we have two different types of media in the country. We have really three now. We have traditional print media, and within that, I think there's two sects. There's the weekly big national newspapers, and then on a very microcosm, you have your community newspapers. And then we have, this realm of social media, which is really a disturbing realm that's really taking over. And I think, we can talk about a few aspects of that. But my anecdotal story was that my one son graduated from university this year. And so I begged them, I have three sons, to go on a holiday with me. I wanted just some time with them where we were away from the noise of life and we were together as a family. And I asked them where they wanted to go, and they said Spain. And I thought, oh, okay. So I was doing a bit of research, and everything I saw online said, in reading and online, I even went so far as to go into some of the papers as much as I could that were English speaking. And it basically said, don't come. We don't want you. You're a tourist. Stay out of Spain. And so I reached out to a tour lady and said, I don't believe in what I read all the time or especially what I read on or see on social media. So I reached out to a tour operator and I said, is this true? What do you think? And she said, no, you're not going to have these issues. So that was my first inkling that in my mind that things weren't the way that it was perceived on social media. And so we decided to go. We spent 4 days in Barcelona and then we flew over to Mallorca and spent 4 days. And my experience there was nothing but amazing. The people were awesome. There was never a time where I felt that we weren't wanted as tourists, that we weren't appreciated for what we were bringing to the country's tourism. There was one little tiny area where we were in the Gothic quarters of Barcelona where there was a sign that said, government control tourism. And I thought that was interesting. And so I kind of left it, didn't have any bad experiences whatsoever. Certainly didn't see the pickpockets and all the things that you see when you're on social media, hold on to your stuff, you're going to get pickpocketed. Like none of that was there. Then we went to Mallorca, and on our last day of Mallorca, I had a wonderful experience there. And that's a completely different experience than Barcelona, because we all know that Barcelona is kind of like the Alberta in Canada area. They want to separate from Spain, and there's all those internal issues going on. But then we went over to Mallorca, and so a completely different type of culture as well. And just again, had the most amazing experience, never felt at any time like we weren't appreciated and wanted. And so the very last day, we went to a really cool restaurant, and we're having a couple of beers, and my kids are loud. We were laughing, and the owner came up and sat with us because it looked like we were having a good time, and just had a beer with us. And we had this conversation. I said, look, I'm in media, and this is what I perceived, and this is not my experience. Can you tell me what's really going on? And his comment was that tourism, and I think it's the same issue that we're seeing in Canada, that he said the majority of the homes are turning into Airbnbs. They can rent them out for $800 a day, which is now creating a housing supply shortage in Spain. And so the youth can't afford to live there. And that's the issue. He said, this isn't about we don't want tourists. What we want is our government to be responsible and control Airbnbs and tourism, that part of the tourism. He said, quite frankly, we've had a slow summer because of all the negative press that we've been getting, and it's really hit us hard in the pocket. And he said, and I said, well, where's it coming from? And he said, well, from two different things. He said, but my honest opinion is that it's coming from the BBC, because they want to drive tourism back into the UK. And if they create an environment for the tourists that they are now perceived to not be wanted, they'll go somewhere else, perhaps to their area. And I just thought, wow, that was that moment for me where it hit me that the power of media is still there. But it wasn't traditional media that was giving the bad rap. It was social media. And that just all falls into my issue with social media on a on a macrocosm issue.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with that. I think and especially the experience, and I've been a lot of places in Europe, and I think there's a lot of that social media thing and the hype, and it's really interesting. I think the last team I took to Budapest, last April, it was the father was really concerned because of the stuff he had seen on social media around Budapest, and it's, I think, the first very long conversation, and it was done through emails and stuff like that. But first very long conversation I had with a parent of a student saying, you know what, yeah, I've done this, I've been there, I know what it's like, I've never lost a student, etc. Those types of things. And it was just really, I think, one of the driving things that's like, yeah, this is a bit of a change from what I've seen before. And then I think in a lot of cases too, just talking to students in the past where, I've been there, I've gone to the competition, and really just some of the questions that were there that were really just interesting in terms of where are you getting this from? And then I think the most biggest one was a few years back, we went to London, and uh, been to London a lot of times. London, yeah, there's some seedy parts, but if you're paying attention, it's a pretty safe place. And my biggest thing was talking with officials at the university, because the Canadian government had marked it as a red zone, as dangerous because of terrorism and all that stuff, and what we had to do with the students in order to allow them to be there as undergraduate students. Just as I say, it's just that piece of it. And then also the other piece of it is just in terms of the media as a whole, just really kind of figuring out what's the reality of the country? What's the reality of the city, of those types of things? And just wondering if you had some thoughts or ideas in terms of how do we,
It's
how
true,
do
right? Well, it's true, and somebody asked me do I read the news on a national level? And I said, of course I read the news. But what I do is I read a plethora of news. So I'll go and I'll read something in CBC, which is so left, it's crazy. And then I'll read something from the Post, which is more right. And then somewhere in the middle is the truth. And I think that's where we've really come into problems within our own media is that, we've polarized it to this to almost the same extent that is being in the US, maybe not as vitriol, but it's definitely the same concept. If I want to read out what's going in the US, I have to read Fox, I have to read CNN, and somewhere in the middle is the truth. And I think that that's a statement on media, period, and that we've lost our way as an industry. And with that, you lose credibility. And the most important thing for a newspaper is to be credible. And I think, we talk about local media, and I think we work, in the crow's nest past because if I don't tell the truth, then I go to the grocery store and somebody's going to call me on it. I have to look at my readers in the face. And so it's a very personal level of the newspaper. There's no part in the newspaper where I have an opinion except for my editorial. And I have an opinion and I write it voraciously in my editorial because that's my job, is to give you my perspective on life. But the rest of the paper is Switzerland in my newspaper. In fact, I've had articles written about me by my own reporter that weren't in the best light, but it was the right thing to do because I said it, or I did something, or I owned it, and it was written about. And so I think, I often say, for example, in Calgary, if you went into a district of Calgary, say you went into 17th Avenue, or you went into Inglewood, or you went into these communities, and you started up a little tiny newspaper in that geographic area, they'd probably do really well because it would be read for people who have an interest in what's going on in their geographic area. Nobody's covering their kids' soccer games and their swimming meets and their races. And that's what community newspapers do. The problem that we're also now having in the country is that, and it's happening even with the big newspapers, is that they've become regionalized. And when you regionalize a newspaper, you've lost the flavor of what a newspaper is. And so you, in essence, have lost your newspaper. And the studies are really showing that when there's not a newspaper in a community, that it creates a vacuum. And people need knowledge, they need information. So they're going to get that information from somewhere. And 9 out of 10 times, they're going to get it off social media, where there are no parameters, where it's all opinion based, where there's no reporters, you can't get sued, there's no fact checking. And so you're listening to somebody's opinion. And you're not only listening to opinion, but then you're geared towards an algorithm that tells you this is what you want to hear. So you're not hearing opposing sides. You're not critically thinking. You're not reading. You're not coming up with conclusions. And it really is like social media has dumbed down society in so many ways that we've really lost our ability to critically think. I even look at what's going on in the US right now with Charlie Kirk, and do I agree with Charlie Kirk with what he said? Absolutely not. But what is absolutely terrifying to me is that a 22-year-old kid who didn't have an ability to reason to the extent that an adult does came up with conclusions based on what? And my guess is that he wasn't reading a newspaper. He wasn't critically thinking. There was a whole bunch of issues going on there. And as a result, there's going to be ramifications to everybody, including him and his family and all of these things. And I think it all comes back to that generation not being able to critically think because they're just so ingrained in what's going on in social media that and they believe it. It's just absolutely mind-boggling to me, but it's because people need to fill a vacuum of space. And when your news isn't doing it, when your news has also lost their way, then it's like it's a slide down into nothingness. And that's really creates that chaos that we're seeing in the world right now. I think it 100% has to do with a lack of good media. It's social media. It's people not having the ability to have face-to-face conversations and debate, to sit around a table and have discussions. It's a myriad of issues, and I think that's why we're in the state of society that we're in right now.
Yeah, no, and I would agree with a lot of that in terms of looking at the students that I've had over the number of years. I'm in a unique position, I think, when I was teaching in terms of I've had students come in as first year students in the classroom, others more senior students in the classroom, and then the special group of students that are very motivated that join case teams, etc. And when I look at the difference between them, those differences are incredibly significant. And I think it comes down to a lot of the idea that, yeah, there's critical thinking is missing. There's for some reason, and I'm going to talk about this in another podcast with a friend of mine called Astrid, and the idea that when I go to case competitions, and I think I noticed this a number of years ago, is the level of things like critical thinking, creativity seem to be, we're driving those out of our children. And I'm not sure where that's happening, if that's happening in the school system, whatever, but it's just not there. When I look at them continent wise, there is more creativity. And that's the one I always look at. When I look at students from Europe or students from Asia, much more creative than the North American students. There are efforts in North America, and I think we're achieving a lot. And the teams from the good schools, we're starting to see that a lot more. But I think, yeah, I think it's a critical thing in terms of how do we get people to think more critically, take in information from all sides
right?
and generate this is maybe where we're at versus it's all like this or this, depending on where your source is.
And we have an inability to have constructive debate. You can't even have a conversation with somebody without being called a racist or a misogynist or a white supremacist. Or we've taken words that are powerful words and we've made the pejorative, and that ability to just have a really good conversation about something so you can see both sides, that's gone as well. And you're right, that the thing in Spain was such a wake up call to me about, I was worried. I'd read it. I'm like, ooh, and my personal experience was far different than what I read on YouTube and Facebook and Instagram and all the things that now show up. So now I'm getting a plethora of don't go to Spain. It's all over the place. But it was that wake up call for me, that moment where the light went off and said, words have power, and we're not taking those words and kind of dumbing it down to say, okay, well, those are the words, what's really happening. And maybe that's travel. Maybe I think a lot of it is the program you're doing. It lets kids see people from outside of their sphere, to see how other countries are doing things, to see why they're being successful versus maybe why we're regressing in North America. It's just so many conversations that can take place that way. I don't always agree with people, but I always listen to what they have to say, because if I don't agree with them, then I might be missing something in that conversation. So I don't think we listen either. We're so bent on getting our point across that we don't tend to want to listen to anything anybody else has to say, which again is that critical thinking component, right?
Yeah. No, and I think another piece of that is, and again, I talk about this a lot, is ego. And it's really interesting when I take undergraduate students and do this. There's not a lot of ego there. But when I've got MBAs, there's a lot of ego. And part of my job is how do we get these people to leave the ego at the door before they start the critical thinking process, start the resolution process. Um and it's interesting because a lot of students have, so I guess starting at my retirement celebration last September, a lot of them asked a little bit more about my philosophy in terms of coaching. And one of the things, and I've never told them this while I was doing it, but I didn't really care what the content they produced was for the first little while that they were learning how to do this process. It was more about how do they work together? How do they start to think together? How do they deal with things like conflict, et cetera, within their group, and talk about that rather than the content, because the content was the easy dilemma, right? It's all of those other pieces, and I think a lot of the stuff you've mentioned pull into that in terms of we're missing a lot of this ability to take the information, think about it, debate it, come up with independent thought, be able to debate our thoughts and kind of figure out, you know what, this one may sound like the best way in terms of, because one of the big things with these teams is to have some agreement, right? And it's not about majority rules or whatever. It's about what one do you think we can defend the best when it comes down to it. And I think we're lacking a lot of that. One of the things you did mention, you talked a little bit about regionalization of more the national media. Do you think, and this is just something that popped into my mind as you were saying that, but I think back then in the old days, a lot of the on the ground media were within the community itself that they were reporting about. And I think we don't see that as much anymore, where it's them sitting at a computer in Toronto reporting about what's happening in Pincher Creek or Calgary or something like that. I think that has a big effect on us.
Oh, it's massive. I mean, that is the effect. When you live in a community, you have a unique perspective of what's happening within that community. And you're right. I mean, somebody's perspective in big city Toronto is not going to be the same as my opinion, in small town Alberta, living in that community. People often ask why we're successful or why we're still here as a newspaper. And I said, because our formula works. We're doing it right. We're reporting on the news that's happening in my community and we're doing it right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
No, and I think,
again, I mean, I have to look at you in the grocery store, right? I'm not going to write something negative about or erroneous about somebody and then have to run into them in the grocery store. I mean, there's some responsibility there that you don't see um, in these papers that have now regionalized themselves because they're really not about the community. We have a community here of 6,100 people, and I sell almost 3,000 papers. So why does that work? Well, and you have to look at the formula and think, okay, well, the formula obviously works. It's not working in the city, but it's working here. And so I think if these papers went back to what papers are supposed to be, that write the story, let the reader make the choice, then I think that we'll get back the respect that we had. The other issue that we're also having in our industry is that there's fewer kids going into journalism. And you can make all this money on social media being nothing, just giving an opinion. And so we have fewer and fewer kids going into journalism, which then really waters down the pot for these incredible journalists that are out there that just are like, why waste my time? And I think that's another issue that's coming in because if you're not trained how to do the job properly, then you're going to end up with the crap that you see on social media. I've been sued now twice myself. Our paper's been sued 5 times. We've lost 3 out of the 5 lawsuits because we didn't do our job. We didn't fact check. We didn't do the things we were supposed to do. And, you know, we're held to a higher standard. So after I got sued, I'll tell you, I worked a little bit harder to make sure everything was right because I was held accountable for actions.
no, and I think that's a huge part around the accountability and that type of piece. I'm wondering just in terms of maybe your thoughts on the idea that you talked about looking at something at CBC, then looking at something in the Post, where we've got fairly both sides as a continuum there. How do we get people to start to think more about the idea that, yeah, there is a bias in each media outlet, that there's some mission, some goal behind that. How do we get people to start to look at different outlets, especially since now we've got a lot of the idea that, yeah, you're paying for access in a lot of cases, and if you want to cover the whole spectrum, there's a lot of money that may need to be spent in order to do that.
I think the first thing we got to do is, and I mean, I'm doing it with my lawsuit. So I'm the one that's suing Google for $4 billion in Facebook. Is the first thing we need to do is we need to get control of the advertising dollars anymore. So it's like a chicken and the egg. So the reason why papers are shutting down is because the ad revenues dried up. Well, the ad revenues dried up because Google and Facebook are taking all the stories that our reporter writes, puts it on their site, and then controls the advertising dollar through monopolies. And so when you don't have money coming into outlets, you have fewer reporters you can hire, fewer qualified reporters you can hire. Then you're relying on government subsidies in order to keep yourself going. And when somebody's paying you money, chances are you're going to want to keep that government in power, right? And so I think it starts with governments first, recognizing that newspapers are viable industry and advertise. I mean, you don't need a handout if you're actually paying for a service. So put your ads in the newspaper, which then gives the newspapers credibility that the government's doing it. That opens up the advertising revenue. And then we need governments to quit subsidizing foreign dollars into Google and Facebook. And I think that's, the decline has been in the last 10 years since Google and Facebook have really just kind of raped newspapers of their money. And so it's the responsibility of the reader and it's the responsibility of those in our industry to step up and do our job properly. And so but you can't do that if you don't have any money. So, it's a really difficult time for industry in this country. I think it's a difficult time for all newspapers in the world. I think we're going to see more and more. We just had another newspaper shut down in Alberta, the Hinton Voice, for those same reasons. We need to really get control over that social media landscape. We need to get control over the advertising. The C18 thing was really cool because what C18 said is the government recognized that Google was using our news, and in order to use our news, they should be paying for that service. No different than an advertiser would. And so that's that infusion of money where you can hire extra reporters, all the things that'll help make you viable. But when CBC's 100%, CBC is the biggest example for me because they're 100% subsidized by the government. Well, how do you think they're going to lean? Do you really think you can be objective when 100% of your funding, and you're a newspaper, a news outlet, comes from money you're getting from the government that's funding you? And so that's really the main issue that's happening right now. So we need to stop funding CBC, quite honestly. They need to be able to figure out how to do it on their own. And I'm not saying the radio portion or the other portions, because I think that's a different entity, but the news portion shouldn't be funded by the taxpayer. I think that they should be a part of the Google C18 money. They should be eligible for that. They should be eligible up to a certain extent under heritage, because it's a heritage industry. But the kind of money we're pumping into organizations like that just breeds bias. It just is what it is.
And you talked about Google and Facebook and that. What about AI? Especially nowadays, when you go to Google, you're getting the summary of who knows what. And is that the truth or
That's gonna be, I think AI in some ways might be almost in some ways the saving grace of some things, because we're on top of the AI issue better than we were on top of Google. Google and Facebook came in and said, "We're gonna make your lives better. We're gonna help you, make more money and keep your industry relevant." And then they turned around and took everything. AI, we're a little bit more on top of it, where we're saying, "Wait a second, you're only viable based on the content that we're producing." But people believe AI. I mean, it's really scary, and AI isn't infallible. It's giving wrong answers. The other day I put something in, and I knew it was wrong. And I said, "You're wrong." And I said, "Yes, you're right. I'm wrong. And here's the right answer." I mean, those are the things that are happening with AI. AI is really scary. But what we're seeing in all of the latest studies from News Media Canada, which is the organization that reps all the papers in the country, is that in the newest surveys they're doing, people are actually starting to go back to reading newspapers, because they are recognizing that something's wrong, that something isn't right, especially right now. And the biggest jump in demographic reading that we're getting is 18 to 25-year-olds, which I have not seen in a decade. I have not seen that number go up. In my world, we've lost that group, but it's actually changing a little bit. And so I'm hoping, and maybe I'm an eternal optimist for my industry, but I'm really hoping that people see AI for what it is, that it's great to give you supplementary information. But again, you got to do your own research and critically think about things, because it's actually a little bit scary.
yeah, I have the same thing. I just did a newsletter a few weeks ago. I'm on a couple of coaching advisory committees for some international competitions, and the big question is how do students use AI in the competition? And I think one of the things that I talk about all the time when I'm on these, and when I talk to students about when we talked about it a couple weeks ago in class, is just this whole idea that yeah, AI does a job of gathering information, but you do have to critically think about it. It's good at, I think, helping generate questions, which I think is a huge piece of the critical thinking part. I'm not so sure that it's good at all of the answers. And again, yeah, I've done on a number of them when I've written cases or something like that. I've put something in and I'm like, yeah, that doesn't sound right. What about this? And there's AI trying to change its answer, or yeah, I'm wrong.
Yeah,
Here's
and
or
apologizes for it. Yeah, sure,
yeah,
right. You said
yeah,
I was wrong.
yeah, yeah,
But
or that's not in my database yet.
yeah, it's been really cool in my industry. Like, it's a great proofreader. It's really freed up time for proofreading. Or you're right. If I have a document that came through on a council meeting, like a really big 50-page document, I can throw it in and say, "Can you give me a brief summary of what's going on here?" And then help me generate 5 really great questions I could ask somebody. I mean, there's parts of it that are really amazing and they streamline you. And then there's parts where you're like, "Ooh, you're not right." And if I put that, in a newspaper, I think it was a lawyer that was disbarred over that, right? He had actually did a case brief, and it was AI generated and it was completely wrong. So those are, and that's the other part about a newspaper, is as soon as you lose that credibility, it's gone. You're gone. You're done, because your most important thing of a newspaper is the credibility of what you're saying.
I use it all the time for proofreading, was the newsletters I've started, etc. I
Wonderful.
am such a slow writer to start with, but I write it out and then here AI go fix this for me, make it a little bit
100%.
better.
And that's
right?
fine because you're it's your information. You're just using technology to your advantage. I mean, people handwrote stuff until there was a typewriter, and then typewriters made it faster. I have no issues with that whatsoever. And sometimes even when I'm writing something, an editorial, and I've got all my points down and I've written it out, and if something doesn't quite work, I'll send it into AI and say, could just, make this a little more clear. I don't have an issue with that because it's my thoughts and my ideas and my opinions. AI is it's what we're seeing. And the other issue with AI, I was in a conference down in Sarasota, Florida recently about AI in newspapers. And they were saying that the amount of information and the technological advance of AI is going to be faster than anything that happened in the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it's what we're seeing right now is going to be completely different 3 months, 3 years, from now. We're going to be in a different world 3 years from now. So it's a bit scary, but I think one of the nice things about newspapers again is that we'll be that anchor of hopefully we'll still be around and we'll be that anchor of truth where you can kind of go back and say, okay, let's hear this from a person, not an AI generated bot.
Yeah, and then, as I say, I think big thing, and I know the last few years I was teaching, there's a lot of discussion around how do we use AI in the classroom. There's a lot of like the idea that students are basically just sending off the question to AI, getting AI to write their paper, and then on the other end, someone's throwing it through. Is this done by AI or is this done on a human side of it? And it's I think one of the reasons thought about retirement is, it's just getting much more difficult and like in the classroom side of stuff. I think still the stuff that I've had fun with and then this project is part of in terms of hopefully helping young professionals and others get and develop those mad skills, those soft skills, I think is still key with that. I think the other thing, and I think this is just something that comes up when I'm talking to students, et cetera, and there's things out there like ground news, which again is kind of AI looking at articles, kind of classifying them in terms of left, right of the spectrum. Do you think those are useful?
I think so. I think what you're going to actually see in the future, and it's been talked about it within the industry, is that there will be a site where you can pay a subscription for as a reader, and it'll go in and tell you if something was generated by AI, whether it's left or right leaning. And I think I think we're going to see something like that come out of the woodwork where content will now go in, and those people who really want to do the critical thinking at least will be able to disseminate who created it. Was it created by somebody or was it created by a bot? Which way is it leaning? And I think that's great. I think that that's when AI is great. I think that's when things like that are, really important. But I question how many people will actually go on it and look and do that. Because I'm just seeing such a dumbing down of society right now with social media that I really worry about, the future of humanity in North America, quite honest. We grew up in a generation where we didn't have it, right? So we were taught to critically think. And there's a ton of people that don't, but there's a good chunk of us as I guess, are we Gen X? Yeah, Gen X who know how to critically think. But this younger generation has never been taught that. I mean, I taught my boys to critically think. We talk at the table, we talk about politics, we talk about the way of the world, we traveled, we've had the ability to have a life where we can travel and see other parts of the world. But a lot of people don't get that. And it's really scary. I went yesterday, just as an aside, we had that Alberta Prosperity Group come in to the Christmas Pass and talk about separation. And I wanted to go there, not because I am for or against separation. I wanted information. And, it's just another situation where there was no real good information presented. It was just emotion. People can't make decisions based on, well, I guess a lot do, but the majority of people shouldn't be making decisions based on emotion. And it's just another thing where it's all about, this is what we have on our social media site. Well, okay, but could you give me some facts? And all of those things are missing. You can't make good decisions if you don't have good information.
I talk about this with when we go and visit our financial planner, which we've done a fair amount lately since with this retirement. It sounds like we're in good shape. But I think even when we start to look at things like the stock market, there's so much emotional reaction to what's happening rather than sort of sound financial happening. And so people react. I think the stock market still has a corrective mechanism to weed that out eventually, but there's so much in terms of, yeah, it's this instant emotional reaction. And I think it's also something I think I struggled with teams over it in terms of they get a case and there is this emotional reaction that they have, or a few members have one emotional reaction, the other, and just getting them to sit back a little bit and realize this is the emotional part of it. How do we remove that piece and start to think about this critically? How do we get to the, as you said, the information rather than, I think, a lot of the fluff that creates a lot of that emotional piece.
Yeah, that's the problem. I mean, I wish if we could solve it, we wouldn't have to worry about going to our financial portfolio person because we would make a gazillion. But yeah, it's the truth. It's I'm worried. I'm worried about a lot of things when it comes to stuff like that. And I mean, I've been able to give my children the ability to see the world from a different perspective, but not a lot of people have that opportunity.
I think we've both been lucky that way in terms of where our kids are at. But yeah, it's something I do worry about.
Yeah, well, compared to what we had for opportunities, right?
And what are we leaving them with a whole bunch of things that are going on, but that's a totally different
That's a
conversation.
whole different. Funny, I was at lunch with a friend of mine today, in an industry, and we were just talking about the state of the world and the future of our children, and that was one of his comments is when they figure out what we've done to them, um, they're gonna be pretty upset, and I just thought it was a really interesting comment. I kind of reflected on that a little bit, so
I did, I think it was last year, and in the case courses that I taught, that I did a case on sovereign debt, and I think it was a good decision long term. Was a very poor decision short term because I think it created a lot of emotional pieces in the classroom that they had to get over. We did eventually get to some good thinking from the students and a lot more awareness of it. But yeah, it was probably one of the hardest cases from, I guess, the instructor end of it that I've
yeah.
ever done. It was
Well, what I
interesting.
think what you do is so important. My youngest son did the SHAD program, so he spent 2 weeks in New York with other students who were kinda high achievers, and they were able to take it their case study was about, immigrants coming and having nowhere to live. That was their case study. He got such a good perspective of what Eastern Canada was like because what he's hearing about Eastern Canada and what Eastern Canada is are 2 different things. He got a perspective on critical thinking about the world outside of himself. And I wish we had more programs like what you do, and we're catching these kids even at that high school level to get more of these kids into these types of programs because I think that they get an opportunity to see the world from a different perspective and a different worldview than what they're getting at home or in their little tiny town of Crow's Nest Pass. And I think those things are super, super important. So thank you for doing that because you've taken a number of kids over your career and have taught them skills that they can now carry on with their children or even their peer groups because kids talk, right?
Yeah. No, I think one of the coolest things was in a few years back where we had just finished an opening ceremonies. We're in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and we just got in
I was just there.
sitting by the Moss River at the Erasmus Bridge, and just talking about why they were doing this. And the conversation was really cool because the conversation was, it's not about the cases. It was about the training. Yeah, it's a little bit about the case, etc. But a lot of the learning. But I think the other piece and the big piece of it was that they got to see how other people live. They got to network with students from across the globe. And it was like, yeah, they get it. They really get it. And it's, as a coaching colleague of mine always said to the teams, we don't get paid for this thing.
That's right.
So it's those are the rewards. I actually just read a LinkedIn post from an MBA student that was at Corvinus in Budapest, and I know the director of the MBA program there really well, and he had commented back to it that, yeah, it's sort of this amazing thing. I just had to sit back and comment back to Miklos saying that, you know what, yeah, it's the reward piece that, and when students reflect on this, that's the reward that we get in terms of the reward of their growth, etc. Is absolutely incredible. And that's what made me keep going, right?
Well, and even on a microcosm after when we were in Spain and the boys and I were talking about that conversation and Aiden said, "Oh, mom, like this was a really important conversation. So we see it from an outside perspective. It's not about the media. It's not about," and it was just a great. opportunity to say, see, see, there you go, right? You got that. If you went one on one, you had a one on one conversation with somebody who lives the life there and you got the truth. And truth is power. Yeah.
I
Good
think
job.
that's hugely powerful. I guess we'll start to wrap this up. And as I say, I usually wrap this up with what's the advice that you give the 20-year-old?
My advice to anybody and any child is to go for it. I mean, I think that when I graduated from high school, I mean, it was 1990. You'd have been about what, 86 or so? 80, 86. And we only had our options were limited, right? If you were a woman specifically, you were going to be a nurse or a teacher. There weren't this plethora of options that we have nowadays. And so my question to people or to young people is be bold. Like be bold, see what's out there, travel as much as you can before you go to school. Critically think, research, read, know all the things that you need to know because what you think you know and what you do know are completely two different things. And so my advice often to young kids is before you open your mouth, make sure you know what you're talking about. So read it, understand it, know what you're doing so you don't look like an idiot. Travel as much as you can before you go to school because I don't think anybody should go to school at 18, although two of my kids did. The oldest one that traveled has a completely different perspective on everything because he spent a year traveling. And I think that there's so much to be gained from that, from seeing different cultures and different people. And be bold, do things that take chances. We weren't encouraged to take chances the way kids are encouraged nowadays. It's an honor. It should be for them an honor and a privilege that they have all these options, and I don't think they even see it.
Yeah. No, I would totally agree with that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Cam. It was great to see you again.